Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast. On the first and third Tuesday of every month, we bring to you our perspectives on theology and culture from a post-evangelical lens. This week, all of the other co-hosts are on assignment, and I had the pleasure of sitting down with Elizabeth Jeffries PhD, author of the brand new book called Through the Kaleidoscope, How Exploring Cell Biology Transforms My Relationship with God. I'm really excited to present this interview with you. Elizabeth has such a great perspective on things and how her work in microbiology has given her these metaphors for life and faith. And it's just wonderful. It's a great book. It's a great conversation. And as usual, for all the ways that you can purchase this book or follow Elizabeth on all different social media platforms, all that will be in the show notes at irenicast.com/146. And we've had a couple interviews. We haven't had a regular episode. And just as a quick teaser, so to speak, let's just say that the first and third Tuesday of July might not be the only times that you get to hear our voice. So stay tuned to the podcast feed. Subscribe if you haven't already to make sure that you don't miss any episodes that we regularly put out, or maybe episodes that might come out randomly that are a surprise. You never know. So with that out of the way, let's get into this conversation that I had this week with Elizabeth Jeffries. As I said in the introduction, we're talking with Elizabeth Jeffries, PhD, writer of the new book, Through the Kaleidoscope, How Exploring Cell Biology Transforms My Relationship with God. This was a great book. I mean, we talked about this off air, but I really enjoyed it. And I have so many questions. So before we get to the actual book itself, I'm curious, what's the technical title? Are you what kind of biologist? I want to make sure that I get all that right.
Yeah, molecular biologist would be the most, would probably be the most appropriate term. But really, in scientific research, all of these divisions tend to blur together anyway. And my training is actually from a chemistry department. So my background, my degree is in chemistry, but then all of my work has been in the biological field, mostly molecular biology. So simple answer, just molecular biology, but longer answer, it's like all of the above. They just all blur together.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So then that's helpful. So as a molecular biologist, how do you go from that to writing a book? Like, what compelled you to tell this story and share these particular insights?
That's a great question because, typically science is conducted in my case, it was in academic environments. So you're sort of in this silo, separate from the rest of the world. Like kind of, we just sit in labs and tinker with things and try to solve problems. It's very easy to separate that from the rest of life. In my case, what inspired me to write the book was I kept encountering, as I would be reading academic papers, I kept encountering, usually it was just a side comment about a certain biological phenomenon that would strike me as so profound. But the author of this paper wasn't really interested in that profound statement. They were interested in the data, the results of these experiments that they were conducting. For instance, I read that biologically, a bacterial cell, a human cell, really any type of cell is capable of transferring portions of its genetic code to other neighboring cells for kind of no reason at all. Like they'll just sort of swap genes. And it's called horizontal gene transfer. And I have a whole chapter about this in the book. And when I read about that, it was just mentioned so casually in this paper. It was a paper where they were tracking the transfer of genes between bacterial cells. And it just struck me as so wild that identifying information could be transferred from one cell to another for no reason other than proximity. So what I started to do was every time one of these observations would just strike me as so absurd or so profound. And sometimes I felt like these observations would give me an insight into human life. So I started to write them down. And I filled up notebooks just with my reflections. Like, this is a thing that cells do, and it gives me some type of insight into an aspect of being a human. For instance, back to this horizontal gene transfer, the way that we pick up things from our environments, the way that we pick up even habits or traits from the people around us, and we don't even notice it. And then over time, a cell, if that gene that's been acquired by horizontal gene transfer, if it no longer serves a purpose, the cell will often just delete it out of its genome. And that was just a beautiful metaphor to me of what we have the freedom to do as people, things in our lives that are serving no meaningful function for us. We have the freedom to just let go of them. And these patterns I started to see in biology, they're not the point of biological research. Like the authors who were writing this paper about horizontal gene transfer, they weren't really interested in the implications of these, of these like bigger picture patterns, the implications of those for human life. So I started to realize, I think that just regular people who aren't necessarily interested in biological research would really get a lot out of this. Like this is really fascinating and kind of a rich metaphor for the human life. So what if I write this down in a way that leaves aside the biological jargon and the data and the quantification, because that's not the point of what I want to explore. I want to explore the ways that biology, the ways that nature can give us a new way to see life. Yeah, that really was my inspiration. I started to fill up those notebooks, and eventually I started to realize, I think this is a book. I think I can weave my own personal story in here and pull some things out using these biological metaphors. It brings some things to life using those lenses.
Right. I like how you I don't know if you coined the term, but I like it, the biological parables, and how you correlated it with that imagery, because I think that's good, because there's a lot of wiggle room within the interpretation of it, but then the science is still what the science is, and the implications of that can extend beyond, like you were saying, the research paper. And I really appreciated that, because I'm not a science person. I cheated my way through all my science classes.
Nice.
And, I'm fascinated by it and I love listening to it. But when it gets down to too technical, I lose track. So your book and The Martian are the two books that I've read where I read the science and I'm like, the way that it's written, I really appreciate it, because as of someone who's awesome, not inclined scientifically, it brought that stuff out of the pages. So I really appreciated that about this book, because it gave me, a simpleton in terms of science, a grounding to be able to relate with what you were talking about. So it's really, really, really well done.
Good. That's wonderful to hear. And that was my full intention as I was writing. I tried so hard to leave aside, terms and jargon and even explanations that wouldn't be part of just an everyday vocabulary, So that's great to hear.
Well, it worked. So
good.
I definitely appreciated it. So then how did because I'm assuming that at some point you had conversations with people where you would share some of these reflections, or even some sort of lecture where that kind of sparked there's not to be too marketing, but there's an audience for this. People need to hear this. And then did you also take into account kind of the landscape that we're in terms of this, I don't know, progressive, Christian, evangelical, all the terms that kind of encompass this space that we're in? Did you kind of look at that and see, wait, not only are people responding individually to this, but there's kind of, and I've noticed that there's a gap in this particular area for direct revelation through scientific discovery.
Absolutely. I left traditional church and really fundamentalist evangelical Christianity. Actually, 4 years ago yesterday was the anniversary of the Supreme Court marriage equality amendment. And that was like the final signal that it was time for me to move on, that I was no longer aligned with where the evangelical church was going and has continued to go. So yeah, that is my story, leaving a system that was handed to me. I grew up evangelical. And after fully, 4 years ago, but it was much longer than that my kind of this time of doubting and questioning and how do we really know? That took a much longer time. But as I went through that, I personally really struggled with, well, how do I now navigate the world? The Bible is the literal truth and inerrant and the absolute word of God that we can take literally. That no longer works for me. So where do I go now? How do I conduct my life? How do I navigate my life? How do I tell even just right from wrong and healthy from unhealthy? And for me personally, I have always found so much inspiration in nature. And that's true from my work in biology up to this just macro level, enjoying our surroundings, enjoying the sunshine, enjoying the out of doors. I've always found inspiration in nature. I find it to be so grounding that our bodies are made of these components that just naturally work together, naturally figure out how to keep living, how to keep surviving. There's an innate drive towards survival in us physically that I find inspiring and that I find grounding. And what I found then, I find myself surrounded by a lot of other people who are also grappling with how do I navigate the world post-evangelicalism, post-fundamentalism. And what I've found is that when I speak about nature and when I would start to bring up the themes of this book, it would click with others. And that was a huge inspiration to me. There was a period of time where I just kept these notebooks to myself. It was just sort of like this journaling habit that I developed. And when I started to share with other people, I found that it clicked, and it helped other people as well. Like, oh, there are themes, there are patterns that are just in the earth, that are just in our natural surroundings and also our natural bodies. Our bodies are telling us something about how to live, how to work together, how to live in reciprocity, to live in community. Yeah. So I found that it offered me and also the friends that I started to share these stories with, it offered us kind of a new paradigm. If we're leaving behind these rigid structures that are kind of rigid in ways that are excluding people, rigid in ways that are bringing us shame and pain, we can pick up something else. We can look to other sources. There are other rivers we can go swim in,
Right.
And those rivers are much deeper and have been flowing for much longer. The natural world, it doesn't get any more foundational and fundamental than that, than what our bodies are made of. Right.
And that's so interesting to me because, we talk about our bodies a lot. It seems to be a common theme in kind of our space because a lot of us were taught for so long to kind of deny that aspect or, ashes to ashes, dust or dust, you're going to be resurrected, whatever theology we land in. And I always think it's interesting, like it's how our experience affects our body and then how our setting affects our body. But it's not something we talk about a lot, is how our body affects our body. Like we've recently had an episode where we talked about the idea of how cosmology shapes our language for who God is. And I believe that our experiences, like the more that we hear from people of color, from women, from the LGBTQ community, it expands our language for who God is. But I also think the true is if we look kind of internal. And I almost consider the things that you're studying and the things that you talk about in this book in terms of like microbiology and kind of going inward as part of that cosmology discussion, because it broadens our language and our understanding for who God is. We only had such restrictive language to talk about before in our religious contexts.
Right. And that, that really leads to the title of the book. I grew up with such a firm, rigid idea of what truth is and what I can trust, what I can trust as a source of inspiration, a source of knowledge, a source of wisdom. And as my personal deconstruction has progressed and as I've kind of come to incorporate all of these other sources of knowledge, like you said, cosmology, our entire vocabulary, that's so true. Our vocabulary about God, stretching back to ancient times, has all stemmed from what we know about about outer space, and what we knew back, way back when about outer space. So that's a source of knowledge. Our bodies are a source of knowledge. Our experiences are a source of knowledge, and our relationships are a source of knowledge. So as I started to kind of bring in all of these, all of these ideas, all of these sources of knowledge, I started to imagine, instead of looking at one fixed image, it's like you're turning a kaleidoscope. It's like you're seeing through all of these different lenses. No image that you see through a kaleidoscope is more real or more true than any other. But you can keep turning infinitely and keep seeing new arrangements, new mesmerizing images. Right. So that's exactly what this process of writing the book brought me to, was just a new place of welcoming knowledge from wider and wider sources, wider and wider spaces. Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's what I loved. Like there's these subtle insights that I was reading the book that really kind of gave me a window into kind of your approach to all this. And one of the quotes that I even highlighted it because it was really interesting. I want to read it real quick. It said, "Rebellion seemed like the most reckless and foolish form of independence." And there's this a great thread throughout the book, almost like a subtle irony. Like you were brought into this system that on the surface should be very comfortable for you in terms of like it's set, it's rigid, there's an explanation for this, and that drive takes you into another form of, on the surface at least, of, rigid, like here's the rules, I just follow this, and how that was what led you to this place to be able to hold paradox in a way that you might not have been able to before. And it's such a refreshing change of pace, because I know a lot of our space is not, and this is, I don't mean this as a negative thing, because I think it's an important part of the whole kaleidoscope, so to speak, of our space, that there's a place for rebellion, there's a place for pushing against the system. But it's refreshing to hear that even within a solid framework or foundation, you can still find these places of mystery and
absolutely,
and hold them the way that you do in this book. And so tell me a little bit about, was there ever like a moment where you kind of saw the connection and really like were in awe of that whole idea of, I went to seek answers, like almost like the posture of proving as opposed to the posture of discovery, and where that transition for you might have happened?
I feel in my experience there really was never a point along my kind of my ramp up to I can't stay in the evangelical church. Along that course, there was never a point where I just was ready to throw the whole thing out. I earnestly believed there has to be something here. there were enough experiences when I was young that truly, and I mean, a lot of these are in the book. There are a lot of references to even things like prophetic ministry that I received that I can't throw it out. I can't throw out all of this stuff. And that's even one that a lot of evangelicals have differing opinions on. But for me, in my experience, there were enough little seeds along the way that gave me a clue, like, there's something here. There's something here. You might have to push past a lot of noise to get to it, but there's something here. And yeah, I felt like I had to go the whole way through it. You can leave your faith by avoiding it, or you can leave your faith by taking it to its full logical conclusion,
Right.
Maybe it's just something in my personality, or maybe it was something about the particular church that I was in, but there was always just this determination in me. Like, no, you tell me X, I am going to take X to its full conclusion. I'm going to take it the whole way, and we'll see where we land. I took it seriously. I took everything seriously. What I have found is that there were these seeds along the way. There were these pieces along the way that I feel I've been able to bring with me. And I don't know if I would have been able to hang on to those pieces if I had a sharp break with my faith, or a point where all right, I've got to throw out this whole thing. It was more a steady progression where at each step I was just like dropping one little piece, and then at this stage, it's like, all right, here's what I've got left. Here are the sources of knowledge that I feel like I can trust, and we'll see where it goes, And that's also part of why the title of the book, or the subtitle of the book, is the way it is. That exploring cell biology transforms my relationship with God, because I see this as a steady, continuing transformation. And there wasn't a sharp, like, one day that I can pinpoint as, this is the day that I left behind my old way of seeing the world. It was like this long, steady progression. And maybe part of that was just sort of a defiant, like, all right, if Jesus and God and everything really is exactly the way they're telling me, I want to make sure that they don't have anything, like, that they've got nothing on me. Do you know what I mean? Like, right. All right, if I die and this turns out to be true, I want to make sure I'm still okay. I think for a while that was my stance. I don't want them to have anything, like, nothing in my file against me.
Right. Well, some of us, we expose the system by breaking the rules, and then others of us, we fully embrace the rules to show the ridiculousness of them, right? Like, and I love that approach to it. And I've often said, like, the reason I'm not an evangelical anymore is because of the values evangelicalism instilled in me, right? It put me down this path.
Yes.
For discovery and exploration, and I still hold on to those values, and I feel like that old setting kind of rejected those values in a way. And I related a lot to your stories of being in church. It sounds like you were in a Pentecostal atmosphere, and
Pentecostal, charismatic, kind of a fundamentalist approach to the Bible and to doctrine, but the whole speaking in tongues, laying on of hands, all of that, right? The altar calls and the prophets. I have letters from old youth pastors who wrote prophecies for me, similar to the tape that you describe in your book, and it's such a unique subset of evangelicalism. Right. It's maybe a small subset. If you're going to take one subset really seriously. I feel like I was in a good church to really take it seriously, because there were not many people going to our church who just kind of went casually. Like, you couldn't stay there if you were just kind of, yeah, I'm going to show up and, say hi to some people. Like, this was almost every night of the week we had something, and you're at church all morning on Sunday. You're back there Sunday night for a class, or, it was such an immersive environment. And I was homeschooled as well. So, we had Bible every day. We had devotions as a homeschool family. Like, it was always a part of my life. So, I mean, depending on how you look at it, it was either like a beautiful synergy or like a terrible storm, like that. This combined with my personality, where I was just like, no, I'm going to take this seriously. I'm going to actually believe the things that I'm being told, and we'll see where I land. It all matched up perfectly.
So this is my question, is then how do you go from that setting to science, right? Because I remember in that setting, science being essentially the devil, right? Like, I'm sure you got the classes of like, here's why the earth is 6,000 years old and here's why scientists are wrong. So in the midst of that, how does number one, how does your love for science spark? And then number two, what is your posture headed into a non-religious, quote unquote, secular college from being homeschooled into the area of the sciences? Is your posture one of evangelism, like learning to change? Or, because I this is kind of scattered, but I get the sense that a lot of what was going on was internal for you, in terms of like your questions and the things that you were struggling with, that if anyone saw you on the outside, they would have had, and I get that indication from the story at the end of your book, that no one would have understood what was actually happened. So what sparked your to reframe, since I got a little sidetracked, what sparked your love for science in that particular culture? And then what was your posture headed into going into that as an actual discipline for your movement forward?
Yeah, those are great questions. As far as sparking my love for science, I feel like I didn't really have much of a choice. Like, in me, there was something that it was like part of my internal processing. Like, part of my operating system just said, you're going to study science. This is what you love. This is what you must do with your life. I mean, from the time I was so little, I've just been fascinated. I remember when I was like preschool age, the first time that I asked one of my parents probably what science is, like, what do scientists do? And they explained it to me. And I remember this feeling, wait, so there's stuff that we don't know yet about the way the world works, like, and about animals and plants and outer space. Like, how is that possible? We've built all these, cities and cars and stuff. Like, the world just felt very it all felt very put together for me, as a little kid. I was like, we've everything. How do we not know what's going on in outer space? How's that possible? And there was something in me that started even that young. Like, I want to be on that frontier, so to speak. I want to be exploring new things. So that's when that spark happened. And it really, I never even considered going in any other direction with my career vocation than as I got older. It was always my strongest interest.
And was there any ever pushback against that?
Really, no. My parents were so encouraging of it. I think they saw my interest, and I remember a little bit of an encouragement to like, oh, won't this be wonderful? You'll be able to evangelize all of these, all of these scientists who don't know Jesus yet. And so there was a little bit of that, but really, I always felt encouraged in it. I always felt supported, and I was always led to believe that this would be a worthwhile pursuit. This would be a good thing to do with my life. really my science. So I was homeschooled the whole way through high school, through the end of high school, and my science curriculum was always written and published by a Christian, young earth creationist, so always from this perspective and there would be entire chapters about why we can't trust the fossil record,
I remember that.
And looking back on it now, I'm like, who asked you about the fossil record? I wasn't curious about that, but why did you bring this up? But it was such an important part of these textbooks to make sure that we knew, that you can't trust that. But I remember even in my parents and definitely in me, there was always I always felt a sense of suspicion. Come on, are we really not supposed to trust, the same people who made penicillin, we're not supposed to trust them.
That's a good point, right?
we wouldn't have hospitals if scientists were just telling us a bunch of lies. I never got a strong, from my family, from the people who are close to me, I never got a strong sense of you've got to be careful out there. The scientists are going to corrupt you. We believed that about everybody in the world, but there was no specific distrust of science. So yeah, that little spark of an interest that started when I was really little, that was just always cultivated as I was growing up.
Then going into college, so you felt pretty confident in terms of, this is a career path I can go. I've been encouraged by my family, maybe some things here and there from the church that were anti or whatever, but what were some of your kind of milestone steps when you were in college that kind of started, not necessarily, well, I guess shaking the foundation of, science, and where, what were some of the things you remember that were immediately incompatible that you had to really reckon with?
When I went to college, I was 18 years old, and I had never been in an educational setting that wasn't homeschool. I had been, and really, I was homeschooled along with a lot of other students in my church, So I was pretty surrounded by people who saw the world exactly the way that I did. And that belief was never really challenged. I never really had to do any type of introspection into my faith. I still did, but very, very internally. And there was nothing pushing me toward that. There was no reason for me to question my faith because I had never met one of these people who we would say were sinners, right? And if I did meet them, it was hello, good evening. Do you know where you're going to go to or do you know if you're going to go to heaven or hell when you die? We were never actually in community with people who saw the world differently, or people who were part of a group that was excluded by our church. So when I went to college, I was dropped into an environment. I went to a public university. So I was dropped into an environment where I knew some Christians on campus, of course. I was very careful to find my Christian friends right away. But I was surrounded by people who saw the world all sorts of different ways, and people who were part of some of the groups that we had decided, were evil. So this is in the very introduction of the book, when I went to college, and for the very first time I met someone who was gay, and I had heard a lot of teaching about how it's wrong to be gay and how this is bad and God hates it. But never in my life had I had a conversation, with someone who is part of the LGBT community. So actually, it was like this rubber hitting the road moment with a lot of these rigid beliefs. And again, back to my stance, I approach things all right, if I am going to be a part of a church that preaches that it's wrong to be gay, then I have to take this to the natural, to its full conclusion. I have to take this the whole way. And if that is true, then that means my friend Joe is going to hell. Like, I can't live my life believing that. I can't live my life believing that about this person who is a great person, And I explore that story, as simple as it was, of just face to face, looking someone in the eye, having a conversation, becoming friends with a person. It completely changed my view of the way that we would evangelize, the way that we would approach people, and knowing nothing about their lives, tell them what God thinks of their lives. The absurdity of that just became very obvious to me when I developed relationships, when I actually put myself in an environment where I would meet, I would more than just walking up to someone and saying, "Hi, I think you're going to hell when you die." Like, actually having a relationship with somebody, it changed the way I saw everything.
So what you're saying is that God's not dead is not an accurate description of college life for a Christian.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, so I feel like there's so many things I want to go through. Well, one of the things, kind of going back to what we talked about in the beginning, that I really found interesting, in line with this theme of how a certain framework and a certain perspective with the same idea can change how we respond to it. But when you talked about and I forget the name of the cell, but that idea of identity by proximity, where you kind of take on just because you're near that thing. It's funny that's kind of the basis. The idea is the basis of fear in a lot of evangelicalism, right? If you go there, then you're going to become like them. You're going to do all that kind of stuff. But how that brought you that freedom, and then just the science behind that idea on how you came to that idea. Because a lot of us will come to that profound revelation by encountering other people's experiences. So can you kind of, for us as a novice scientist or whatever, explain a little bit in that chapter, like, what do you mean by identity by proximity? Because you related that cell formation to your own search for identity in Christ, that term that we use a lot. So
Right. Yeah. So biologically, there's really no more foundational manifestation of identity than DNA, our genetic code. And we think of this as this, like it, sort of like a computer program or this code that defines who we are. And we think of it as an unchanging, identifying piece. So, if your DNA changes, that's a different person, right? Like, it's not going to change for your entire life. The reality, though, of genetics is that there is a dynamic aspect to genetic identity. And this was actually discovered in bacterial cells. Scientists who were studying the transfer or the spread of bacterial resistance to antibiotics, they discovered that resistance was spreading way too fast. It wouldn't be long enough for resistance to be inherited by a new generation. That amount of time would not have elapsed, and the entire bacterial population was already resistant on a genetic level. So somehow the genetic code of a bacterial cell that's way over there is changing on the basis of a stimulus that it never received. So there's some type of, it's like this, it's almost like a contagion, the way that this resistance gene would spread throughout the population. And as I mentioned earlier, that acquired gene, the cell then later in its life does have sort of an autonomy, an ability to let go of a gene that doesn't serve its purpose, that doesn't, provide it some meaningful function. So I started to see that as a metaphor for the ways that our identities can shift and change over time, and the power that we have, the freedom that we have to take on things we want to take on and to let go of things that we want to let go of. And, when we think of that, we can either see it as kind of a fearful, oh no, what's going to happen to me?
Right. Uh-huh.
We can see it in that light, or we can see it as like, oh, what a playground we find ourselves in. What a fun experiment this could be, to try something new and see if it fits. If it does, great. If it doesn't, let it go and move on. And all throughout that transition, I stay the same. I stay the same person. There's a continuity in my identity throughout these transitions, but there can still be this dynamic aspect to our identity. Right.
Yeah. I love that. I remember kind of this idea, like the double-edged sword of all these metaphors. And I suppose that's the nature of a metaphor, right? It's open-ended enough to where we can all take our perspective from it. But I think that behind all that, there's something very profound to be said about our proximity to things and how they form and shape or keep us stagnant.
Right. There was a lot of talk in my church about the slippery slope,
Yes, yeah.
Like, oh, if you take one step, you're just downhill. And then oddly enough, in my freshman year logic class in college, we learned about the slippery slope fallacy was one of the logical fallacies that we learned about. And I was like, oh, maybe it's not true.
Maybe.
Right. But seeing this pattern in nature, it almost gives me a sense of comfort. Like, oh, we're all changing. We're all transforming down to ourselves. The only thing that's constant throughout life, throughout orders of magnitude of life, the only thing that's constant is change, transformation. We're always shifting, always changing.
Right. Yeah. It's nice to see that that's part of how we kind of just live, and that it's okay. Because I think people have a conflicting relationship with change. If at all possible, we want to avoid it. And I think that knowing that it's just part of the cycle of where we're at is comforting.
Exactly. It's, and it's scary. It's scary to see transformation, and not all, even on a biological level, not all change is beautiful and comfortable and good,
Right.
There's also decay and degeneration. It's all a cycle. All of it is a cycle, but there's so much joy to be found in leaning in and surrendering to that cycle and recognizing this is what we were born into. We were born into a dynamic system of change and even of aging. Things break down, things wear out, even our bodies are finite, and recognizing that and embracing it, for me, gives me so much joy and gives me a sense of just wanting to embrace what we have now.
Yeah, absolutely. And just that it's going to happen anyway, right?
Exactly.
And that kind of brings me to this next thing that I didn't have a problem with in terms of like disagreeing, because I agree with it, but I have more of a problem with like accepting it. So this notion that you talk about of participation versus contribution. And
right.
That really hits home for me, right? So I feel that I have a tendency to lean towards my value being what am I contributing, not just that I'm participating. And so kind of unpack that a little bit. Like when you talk about that idea of participation versus contribution, what do you mean? And then what was the scientific revelation that kind of fleshed out that metaphor for you?
I think it's very natural and normal. That you say you feel like your value is in your contribution. I feel like that's a part of what we're taught. I mean, certainly in the US, it's just part of our language. And what I find is that in the evangelical church, there's kind of an added layer emphasizing the importance of contributing, the importance of doing something, giving something, having some type of fruit, right? For, the fruit of your faith. Like, your faith is supposed to have real, tangible outcomes. And in my church, that was usually we would look to things like, well, how many people have you preached the gospel to? And even like your family relationships. There was so much pressure, like your marriage would be the fruit of your faith, your relationship with your family, all of these things would be fruit or an outcome.
And it was always on the brink of crisis, right? You're just one step away from everything falling apart, right?
Right. Absolutely. So much pressure. And also our contribution, that there was a lot of pressure to do things for the church, to serve the church. And in my case, and I think this is the case for a lot of evangelical churches, we were a freestanding, not part of a denomination, really functioning on tithes and offerings, really. That was keeping our church in business, that was paying the mortgage of the building, and the pastor's salaries, everything. So there was a lot of pressure to donate financially, to serve, to volunteer, teaching the kids and leading the worship, all of these things that can be a really healthy way to build a community. And it can also be a very manipulative way to guilt people. If you've experienced any type of freedom or joy or peace in your life as a result of this church, then you owe it to this church. There's kind of a dark side of that model of community building. And from my perspective, growing up in that, I got a really consistent message that if you're going to be part of this community, you need to do something. You need to contribute in some way. And the insinuation was sort of like, you owe it to this group you're participating in to give something back, to serve. So as I kind of got older, this didn't sit well with me. Personally, as I started to go through phases of my life where I was grappling with my faith, I was struggling with my faith, and I didn't feel like I was in a place to really serve or contribute or be the person who at church who's like giving out the pamphlets, and smiling at everyone, or the person who's on the worship team, or, I didn't feel capable of being a contributor. And that for me translated into a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. I don't even deserve to be a part of this community. I don't deserve to be just taking up space in this if I'm not giving back in some way. And then over the course of it, going through school and then working in the field of biology, I learned about this phase of cellular life called quiescence. And quiescence is a phase of dormancy in cellular life. So replication pretty much stops. And most of our healthy, normal cells that are in a normal phase of life in our bodies are constantly making new replacement cells. There's a constant turnover. Quiescent cells don't do that, though. They slow down. They stop making most of the protein products of their normal lives. They stop producing those. And all they do is sit and take up resources, take up energy, and they don't really give much to their environment. When scientists first discovered this phase of life, there seems to have been an assumption that this is maybe a response to scarcity. Like, if the body is not able to find, like if food is scarce and resources are scarce, maybe they shut down part of their cells. Like maybe this is like a defense mechanism. That was an assumption. If the cell is not in a favorable environment, maybe it enters quiescence as a way of protecting itself. Or maybe something goes wrong. Maybe quiescent cells are just broken, like they're on the way to dying or something. But then what baffled the scientific community was the discovery that most of the cells in a human body, an adult human body, are quiescent. Most of our cells are in this phase of dormancy. And if you look at different kinds of organisms, from small insects up through humans, so different sizes and different lifespans, if you arrange animals in that way, the animals that are larger in adulthood and that have longer lifespans have a higher proportion of quiescent cells in their bodies. And what happens is over time, those quiescent cells can get called back into action. So as the body ages, humans, we live the majority of our lifetimes as our adult, in our adult size. So we go through this very rapid phase of growth in childhood. And then we have just decades and decades where we're living, not really growing though. And without those quiescent cells, we wouldn't be able to have the longevity that we do. Those dormant cells over time get called into action to replace aging cells. So that dormancy, the phase of dormancy, is actually what allows our bodies to live as long as we do. And it's kind of like it's a marathon versus a sprint kind of of a distinction. Like if we want longevity, a portion of our bodies has to be just kind of chilling out for a while, has to be dormant for a while.
So hypothetically, if all of your dormant cells disappeared right now, what would happen to you? I mean, you would probably just be like a few organs that are rapidly proliferating. I would imagine like you'd be mostly gone. Wow. So just their, like not their function, but their very existence is vital.
Absolutely. Right. Our bodies wouldn't be what we are.
Wow.
Without these dormant cells, they're an important part of the biological community of a human body. They're absolutely vital, even though that measurable product isn't there. And learning about this changed the way that I think about contribution, because there is an essential contribution that all of our dormant cells are making, but we can't really measure it in the moment. You have to look over a long time span in order to see it. So the way that we judge our contributions, the contributions that other people make in our communities, the way that we judge those, we can't make judgments just based on what we can see and measure now. That would be, we would be missing the bigger picture. The bigger picture shows us that over time, every piece is participating and contributing to the whole. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that has such profound implications on politics, the way that we approach community, the way that we approach church. And we tend to, especially in our country, live in a mode of the immediate. I mean, we run in 4-year cycles, right? And that's,
it certainly doesn't jive with capitalism.
It
doesn't. And that the ways that capitalism shapes my views of the world, and I have to imagine for so many others in the Western world, especially, the ways that influences our view of what it means to be valuable. It's so profound. It's so deep. So seeing another lens that runs counter to that it opens me up in so many ways.
Right. I love that. Like it's a hard pill to swallow personally.
Yeah, it is. It's so hard. Right. Because, like I've been building my entire identity on what I contribute. Right.
Exactly.
It's a tough one. Yeah.
But it's also, at least for me personally, and I hope for a lot of other people, it's also that glimmer of hope, right? Like,
oh my goodness.
I can actually exist without this constant internal struggle of, am I bringing something to the table? And maybe just being at the table is enough. And it's freeing and scary at the same time.
Absolutely. And there's this sense, every cell that's part of the body participates together, and there's just this image of belonging, there's this image of almost just by existence, there is belonging. There's dignity in every piece. And our bodies, there's no leader of our biologically in our cells, there's no leader that's like designated to go around and make sure everybody's doing their job. Like it's reciprocity. So, each piece contributing and working together, supporting each other in the ways that they can, and that just gives me hope and it gives me comfort.
That's so great. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us this week and sharing a little bit about your book. How can people find you on the internet and your continued work?
Right. The best way to find me online is to go to my website. It's elizabethjeffrieswrites.com. And if you go there, I have a link to my email subscription list. So if you subscribe there, that's a great way to be the first to know about events surrounding this book release and my further work. You can find me on Twitter at EPJeff, and you can find me on Instagram at EPJeffries. And also, I know that listeners of this podcast are spread out all over the U.S. I also have a few events related to my book launch in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, if anyone is in that part of the country, in late July. So all of that information is on my website, elizabethjeffrieswrites.com.
Sounds great. And we will make sure to put that in the show notes at Irenicast.com/46. We'll have links to everything that Elizabeth is a part of, including how to get the book, right? So what's the official release day of the book?
Right. Release day is July 14th, and you can find it on Amazon. And if you're so inclined, hit up your local bookstore and ask them to stock it for you. That would be like above and beyond. But yeah, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, July 14th.
Right. So as you're listening to this book is out right now. We will put a link in the show notes again at Irenicast.com/146 so you can purchase this book. It is great. It is refreshing. It is something that deserves to be sat down with, especially if you're scientifically, or if you're not scientifically minded like myself, like you're just fascinated by it. It's a great read, and the parallels between how she intertwines her story into these amazing scientific insights is great. So this is a new book of parables that everyone should pick up. So thanks again, and we will see you all next time on Irenicast. Thanks for joining the conversation.